Hello and welcome. I've got a story for you today that is not from the book of Daniel, as opposed to all of the ones that we've had before, but Daniel is a little bit involved in this. And I have to set this up first by saying that we are going to be in the book of Ezra. And the book of Ezra is kind of interesting in a couple of ways because the book in the Bible falls right after the book of Second Chronicles. And Second Chronicles was more of a historical um, perspective, a series of stories telling about all the kings of Israel and Judah. And when it gets to the end, then it tells a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar coming in and destroying Jerusalem, burning down the temple, breaking down the walls, killing a lot of people, and then taking the Jewish people off into exile into Babylon. And as you know, if you've listened to the stories from Daniel, that revolves around a lot of these people who were taken off into Babylon. Now, with Ezra, it picks up kind of where Daniel's about to leave off, and so it goes together pretty well. And what we've got in the book of Ezra is a story that the part we're going to tell doesn't have Ezra in it. He doesn't show up until later on in the book, but the lesson we want to get is from this first part. Now, you may know that the temple was a real big deal to the Jewish people. In fact, when they were wandering in the wilderness, they had a tent of meeting that they used for their worship ceremonies and things centered around that. Well, eventually, Solomon was the king who was allowed to build an actual building that would stay in one place. And that served the Jewish people well. Um, for the most part, it served them. They didn't always serve it. And that meant they didn't always serve God and they were rebellious. And that's the reason Nebuchadnezzar got to come in and take them off into captivity. So, what you had here was the Israelites had started off with 12 tribes. By the time they are carried off into captivity, the last of them, there are three tribes left and little bits of some of the other tribes. And part of that is another story for another day. But what you have who've been carried off into Babylon and now are under the Persians um, are what's left of three tribes and a few of those other folks. Um, so, as often happened back in those days, things stayed pretty much the same until a king died. Now, the bigger and more powerful the king, the more things might change. Now, Jeremiah was a prophet. And before I go any farther, I want to let you know a prophet is someone who works for God. And we have a lot of people who work for God these days, but a prophet had something special in that God would speak directly to the prophet or reveal things in dreams and things like that in visions. And that person, the prophet, would know um, what to tell the people. A lot of times the people didn't listen, but the prophet would do his job. And there was one named Jeremiah who had said that the the Jews would be carried off into captivity for 70 years, and at the end of that, they would get to come back. Well, that was getting real close, and Daniel was awful nervous about that at the time. And that's really the only mention I'll bring up uh, as far as Daniel goes, because he wasn't sure it was going to happen, but it did happen. And the way it happened was, as I mentioned, a king dies. So Cyrus had come in. He had taken over Babylon with the Medes and Persians, and you may remember I'd mentioned Darius at one time. Now, one of the things that gets a little confusing is just like now, a lot of people back then would have the same names. So there was a Darius the first and a Darius the second, and that's the way you'd keep up with them. Cyrus came in and he said, "Okay, I'm going to let the Jewish people go back to the land they came from." And that was not real unusual during times. As I said, when you had a powerful king, things like this could happen. And Cyrus did that with a number of groups, saying that, oh, the Babylonians took you into captivity. I'm going to let you go back to where you came from. Well, that was not always something that the king was doing just because he was a nice guy. Uh, in the case of the Jews, it appears that he was especially motivated, and Jeremiah had said before Cyrus was born that this was going to happen. So God must have intervened in this one. But one of the things he probably thought was that, okay, I've got some people here, and some of them have been doing a very good job working for the empire that I just took over. For instance, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and there were no doubt a few others. And so he wanted to maintain the loyalty of these people, or at least ensure they weren't going to cause trouble. And he could easily do that by saying, oh, you can move back to this land where you used to live, and the people think, all right, this is a good guy. Now, turns out that this land belonged to him because he took it when he took the empire. So he had the things that were taken from the temple by Nebuchadnezzar given back to the Jews and said, okay, you can go. Now, all of them didn't go. Some of them would have gone back. They were ones that wouldn't be so good about following God anyway, might have decided we'll go there and then we'll go elsewhere. But for the people who wanted to follow God, they were thrilled to go. Now, all of them couldn't go at the same time just because you'd have to plan for this sort of thing and you might have to save up money and all that because getting from Babylon or wherever in the empire they were, but I'm thinking now Babylon, back to Jerusalem would take about 4 months. So that was for you to go, that was for you to send a letter, and then another 4 months to get one back. So if you were there in July and you left, it would be about Thanksgiving before you got there. So you had to think about these things and plan ahead. All right. So people started heading back, and about the first thing they did when they arrived and settled in was said, okay, we've got to rebuild the temple because that was one of the things Cyrus told them to do when they got back. And that was a key to the Jewish people staying together, is that they would have their temple and be able to worship God. So since he had directed them to do that, they had to get about that task. Now, building a temple was not a quick thing to do. And the first thing they had to do before they even started on the temple was to rebuild the altar so they could start doing sacrifices to God. That was the most important thing. The building, while somewhat important, wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was that they focused on God and worshiped Him. So they were doing that. Well, there were some people who lived in the area. They had been moved around too when they had been conquered. And they said, they came up to the Jews and said, okay, we want to help you with this because we worship God too. And the Jews said, no, you're not part of us. And that sounds a little bit mean at first, but what you have to remember is that these folks didn't really know God. It was almost like they knew that Cyrus had given them this direction and they wanted to look like they were helping out one of his orders so that he wouldn't be angry at them for anything, or they could show him that they were loyal to him. They didn't really know much about the real God. And the way they show this is that when the Jews told them, no, you can't help us, they got angry and they wrote a letter off. Now, by this time that they sent it, Cyrus had died. Now, it makes sense that they waited till he died because since it was his order to rebuild the temple, then they weren't going to go directly against something he said. But he died. He was followed by a king named Xerxes, who was followed by a king named Artaxerxes. They wrote the letter to Artaxerxes and said, okay, the Jews are troublemakers. We just want you to know that if you look back in the records with Nebuchadnezzar, you will see that they were rebellious and caused him all kinds of trouble. And with the way they're doing things, with them building this wall and all that, they're going to cause trouble. So they sent it off. Wait 4 months, it gets there. Artaxerxes decides to look into this. He finds out, sure enough, back during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, they had rebelled, the Jews, had rebelled. And so he sends a letter back, takes another 4 months, comes back, and he says, stop everything until I say otherwise. Well, the Jews had no choice but to follow that. Now, they still had plans. They still were trying to do what they could, but they pretty much could not continue with the construction. So they had to wait for the next king to come along, which meant they had to wait for Artaxerxes to die. Well, they did that. The next Darius comes along, and they write him a letter. Now, what they did in the letter was very smart, and it was the right thing to do. When they wrote the letter to Darius, they said, if you'll look into your records, you will see that Cyrus had said we could rebuild our temple when he allowed us to come back home. And it is true that our fathers ahead of us, and you may remember I've said that father could mean grandfather, great grandfather, and so on all the way back, that our fathers didn't follow our God well, and he had Nebuchadnezzar come in and destroy the temple, but Cyrus had said we could rebuild the temple. So you see right here, they were going ahead and admitting the bad things in their past as they are making a case for Darius to allow them to rebuild the temple. You know, with the people trying to stop them, they didn't say anything good about the Jews. They were just saying the bad stuff. Here, the Jews were actually saying, well, here's the bad stuff about us, and here's the good stuff. So Darius got the message. He looked it up. He found out what the Jews had told him was accurate. And the funny thing that happened with this was he sent orders back saying, you can rebuild your temple, and I'm sending you some money to help out with this. And so he sent a lot of silver and gold. He gave very precise instructions that no one was to stop them or hinder them from building the temple. Now with that, I'm going to stop with this part of the story. It took a long time for the temple to be completed, but the Jews worked at this and they got it done. And the lesson we learn from this is sometimes when you're trying to do the right thing, there will be people who will try to stop you. And it may seem like God's not listening, but sometimes God has timing of his own, and it may take a long time. In this case, they had to wait 16 years before they could resume their building of the temple. So don't be discouraged if things don't go the way you think they should go, even if you know it's the way God thinks it should go, because in the end, what God wants to be done will be done. Now with that, I'm going to leave the story with you, but first, let me show you my tie today. Has all kinds of building tools on it. Now, the people back then wouldn't have had these kind of tools, but just to give you an idea that if you're going to build something, you would need tools, and they definitely had theirs that they would use. So I hope to see you next time, and hope you think about this lesson a little bit. Talk to you soon.